July 21st, 1944. Guam, Mariana Islands. Dawn broke over the island as a column of modified M4A3 Sherman tanks rumbled toward the Japanese defensive line. Lieutenant Colonel James Woodruff of the 3rd Marine Division watched through binoculars as his men prepared for the assault on what intelligence had described as moderately fortified positions. The Japanese defenders, dug into their reinforced concrete bunkers, believed their positions were impregnable against conventional tank attacks. They had no idea that the approaching Shermans carried a weapon that would forever change their understanding of modern warfare. Before we dive into this story, drop a quick hi in the comments and tell me where you're watching from. It really helps support the channel. This is the account of how American ingenuity transformed ordinary tanks into nightmarish weapons that could project liquid fire, and how this technological advancement broke not just Japanese defenses, but also the psychological resolve of soldiers who had been trained never to surrender. Captain Robert Harding had been with the 3rd Marine Division since Bougainville. At 32, he was older than most of his fellow officers, having joined the Marines after a career as a petroleum engineer in Texas. His expertise had landed him as the commander of a platoon of the newly deployed M4A3R3 Sherman tanks, modified with the Navy Mark I flamethrower system. The brass called them Zippos, after the popular cigarette lighters. These aren't just tanks anymore, Harding explained to his crew during their final briefing. They're psychological weapons. One burst from these flamethrowers, and the enemy will understand they're facing something they've never prepared for. The crew listened attentively. Sergeant Thomas Miller, the gunner, was a 23-year-old former steelworker from Pittsburgh. Corporal David Chen operated the radio and served as loader, while Private First Class James O'Neill drove the tank. The newest addition, Private William Jackson, was responsible for maintaining and operating the flamethrower system. "Remember," Harding continued, "we've got 290 gallons of napalm mixture. Each burst consumes about a gallon per second, and we can hit targets up to 150 yards away. Use it strategically. We don't have unlimited fuel." Meanwhile, across the battlefield, Captain Toshiro Nakamura of the Imperial Japanese Army's 29th Division surveyed his defenses. The 29th had been on Guam for 18 months, constructing an elaborate network of bunkers and pillboxes. Nakamura had personally overseen the reinforcement of his command bunker with concrete walls 3 feet thick. "The Americans will waste their ammunition against our positions," Nakamura told Lieutenant Hiroshi Tanaka, his second-in-command. "When their tanks approach, our 47mm anti-tank guns will destroy them. Then our infantry will counterattack while they're in disarray." Tanaka nodded, but his eyes betrayed concern. "Sir, intelligence reports suggest the Americans have deployed new weapons, possibly modified flamethrowers." Nakamura dismissed this with a wave. "Our bunkers are designed to withstand direct artillery hits. No flamethrower can penetrate reinforced concrete. The Americans relied too much on their technology instead of the fighting spirit that wins wars." At 0700 hours, the American artillery barrage began. For 45 minutes, 105mm and 150mm shells pounded the Japanese positions. When it lifted, a squadron of F-6F Hellcat fighter bombers screamed overhead, dropping 500-pound bombs on suspected strongpoints. The ground attack would begin as soon as the aircraft departed. Colonel Stanley Matthews, commanding the regiment, gathered his company commanders for final instructions. "Intelligence indicates approximately 500 Japanese troops in heavily fortified positions along this ridge," he said, pointing to the map. "Previous experience at Saipan shows these bunkers can withstand conventional artillery. That's why we've been assigned the flame tanks." The statistics were staggering. Standard tanks fired shells that might or might not penetrate a bunker. The flamethrower tanks projected a stream of jellied gasoline burning at 1800 degrees Fahrenheit, capable of flowing into gun ports and ventilation systems. Regular infantry flamethrowers carried by individual soldiers contained just 4 gallons of fuel and had a range of 40 yards. These tank-mounted systems carried 72 times more fuel and could hit targets nearly 4 times further away. The Japanese have fortified this island for 2 years, Matthews continued. They've built approximately 120 concrete bunkers and pillboxes in our sector alone. Intelligence estimates they have 47mm anti-tank guns covering the approaches. Our flame tanks will target the bunkers, while standard Shermans provide covering fire. As the infantry and tanks moved forward, Private Jackson felt the weight of responsibility. The flamethrower system had been explained to him in technical terms. 290 gallons of napalm mixture pressurized with nitrogen to 355 psi, projected through a specialized nozzle mounted in place of the tank's 75mm gun. What the technical manual didn't mention was what happened when that stream of fire hit a target containing human beings. The advance began slowly. The terrain was difficult. Coral outcroppings, dense vegetation, and carefully planned Japanese fields of fire. The lead Sherman took a direct hit from a concealed anti-tank gun, erupting into flames as its ammunition cooked off. The column halted momentarily. "All tanks, this is Harding," the captain's voice crackled over the radio. "Enemy anti-tank position spotted at grid reference Charlie 6. Flame units hold position. Standard Shermans, suppress that gun." 2 Shermans with conventional armament traversed their turrets and fired a barrage of 75mm shells at the Japanese position. After several direct hits, the anti-tank gun fell silent. "Resume advance," ordered Harding. "First objective is the bunker complex at the base of Hill 382. Inside his bunker, Captain Nakamura felt the ground shake as American shells impacted nearby. The concrete walls had held, just as he had predicted. Through his observation slit, he could see American tanks approaching, followed by Marines in combat gear. "Prepare to engage," he ordered. His men readied their weapons, 7mm machine guns, mortars, and rifles. They had trained for this moment, prepared to die honorably for the Emperor if necessary. None would surrender. That much was certain. The American advance continued methodically. Standard Shermans fired at suspected Japanese positions while the flame tanks held back, waiting for confirmed bunker locations. The Marines moved forward in bounds, taking cover behind tanks and natural features. "Bunker complex spotted," reported Lieutenant Frank Reynolds, leading a rifle platoon. "At least 3 interconnected positions with firing ports covering the approach, taking machine gun fire." Harding's tank ground forward to a position where it could target the bunker complex. "Gunner, prepare to fire flamethrower," he ordered. Sergeant Miller switched from the main gun controls to the flamethrower system. "Flamethrower ready, range 120 yards, he reported. "Fire," ordered Harding. Miller pressed the firing switch. With a dull roar, a stream of burning napalm erupted from the tank's turret, arcing through the air before splashing against the face of the Japanese bunker. The flaming liquid spread across the concrete surface, flowing into firing ports and ventilation holes like water, finding the path of least resistance. Inside the bunker, panic erupted. The Japanese soldiers had been prepared for shells, for bullets, even for hand-thrown grenades. They were not prepared for liquid fire that poured through their gun ports, igniting everything it touched. The temperature inside the bunker rose instantly to unbearable levels. "Water! Bring water!" shouted a sergeant, but it was futile. The napalm continued to burn, consuming oxygen and generating toxic smoke. Men scrambled for the rear exit, only to find it covered by Marine riflemen waiting for just such an evacuation. The American infantry watched as the flamethrower tank methodically moved from one bunker to the next. Each received the same treatment, a precise jet of flaming napalm that found its way inside through any available opening. The psychological effect was immediate and devastating. Even Japanese soldiers in positions not yet attacked could see what was happening to their comrades. "What kind of weapon is this?" gasped Lieutenant Tanaka, watching through binoculars as another position was engulfed in flames. "The bunker isn't destroyed, but everyone inside." Captain Nakamura's face remained impassive, but his mind raced. His military training had never prepared him for this. The Americans weren't just killing his men, they were changing the nature of the battlefield itself. Positions that had been designed to withstand conventional attacks were death traps when targeted by these flame weapons. By mid-morning, the American advance had covered nearly 400 yards. Slow progress, but steady. 8 Japanese bunkers had been neutralized by the flame tanks. Marine casualties were relatively light, 17 wounded, 3 killed. The Japanese had lost an estimated 70 men, with more trapped in surrounded positions. "We're making good progress," Colonel Matthews told his company commanders during a brief halt. "The flame tanks are performing beyond expectations. Japanese resistance is still determined, but there are signs of disorganization in some sectors." Captain Harding used the brake to check on his tank systems. "Fuel status?" he asked Private Jackson. "We've used about 120 gallons, sir. That leaves us with 170 gallons, enough for about 3 minutes of continuous firing." Harding nodded. "We won't need continuous firing. Short bursts are more efficient. How's the pressure system holding up?" "Nitrogen pressure is stable at 350 psi, all systems operational." While the Americans regrouped, Captain Nakamura called his remaining officers together in his command bunker. The situation was deteriorating rapidly. Nearly a third of his defensive positions had been neutralized, primarily by the American flame tanks. "We must adapt our tactics," Nakamura stated flatly. "The bunkers are no longer safe against these weapons. We will shift to a mobile defense, using the cave systems in the higher ground." Lieutenant Tanaka looked shocked. "But sir, we've spent months fortifying these positions. Our orders are to hold this ground at all costs." "And we will," Nakamura replied sharply. "But not by dying uselessly in bunkers that have become crematoriums. We will draw the Americans into the ravines where their tanks cannot follow. There, our infantry will have the advantage." The change in tactics came too late for many Japanese units. As the American advance resumed, more bunkers were systematically targeted by the flame tanks. The procedure became routine. Conventional Shermans would suppress the position with machine gun fire to keep defenders away from their weapons. Then the flame tank would approach and deliver its devastating payload. Private Jackson found himself becoming clinically detached from the human consequences of his work. "Pressure nominal, flame on," he would report, watching as the stream of fire struck its target. He couldn't see the men inside, couldn't hear their screams over the roar of the tank's engine and the whoosh of the flamethrower. It was almost possible to pretend he was simply operating a machine, not delivering a horrific death. By early afternoon, the Marines had reached the base of Hill 382, where intelligence indicated the Japanese had established their command center. Here, the terrain became more challenging for tanks: steeper slopes, deeper ravines, and more densely placed bunkers. Colonel Matthews ordered a halt to reorganize for the final push. "We've destroyed or neutralized an estimated 32 enemy bunkers," he told his officers. "Intelligence suggests another 40 on the slopes of the hill, including their command center." The flame tanks had proven their worth, but they had limitations. Each carried enough fuel for about 5 minutes of total firing time, and they had already used much of their capacity. They were also vulnerable to close-range infantry attacks with explosive charges or mines. "We'll concentrate our remaining flame resources on the key defensive positions," Matthews decided. "Standard tanks and infantry will handle isolated resistance." As the Americans prepared for their final push, Captain Nakamura assessed his deteriorating situation. Nearly half his force was dead or wounded, and many survivors were showing signs of psychological breakdown after witnessing the effects of the flame tanks. "The Americans have introduced a weapon that changes everything," he told Lieutenant Tanaka. "Our men were prepared to die honorably in battle, but not to be burned alive inside positions they thought would protect them." Tanaka nodded grimly. "Some of the younger soldiers are talking about surrender." Nakamura's expression hardened. "Remind them of their duty to the Emperor. No Japanese soldier surrenders. We will make our final stand in the command bunker. It is the most heavily reinforced position we have." The American advance resumed at 1500 hours. As predicted, Japanese resistance stiffened as they approached Hill 382. Anti-tank guns concealed in the higher ground opened fire, destroying one standard Sherman and damaging another. Infantry units encountered determined counterattacks from Japanese soldiers emerging from cave positions. Captain Harding's tank ground forward, its tracks crushing the rocky terrain. Through his periscope, he could see the main Japanese command bunker, a low concrete structure built into the hillside, with multiple firing ports and what appeared to be a reinforced steel door. "That's our primary target," he told his crew. "We'll approach from the eastern side, where the ground is more level. Miller, prepare for maximum range firing. We may only get one shot before they target us with anti-tank weapons." Inside the command bunker, Captain Nakamura heard the approaching tanks. He had gathered his remaining officers and about 40 soldiers in what he believed was their most defensible position. The concrete walls were thicker here, the firing ports smaller and better angled. They had stockpiled ammunition, water and rations for a prolonged defense. "The Americans will not easily take this position," he assured his men. "Their tanks cannot climb to our location without exposing their vulnerable undersides. Their infantry will have to advance uphill against our concentrated fire." What Nakamura didn't know was that Harding had studied the terrain carefully. There was indeed a narrow approach from the east that would allow a tank to get within flamethrower range without exposing its vulnerable bottom armor. "Distance to target?" Harding asked. 140 yards, sir," replied Sergeant Miller, "at the edge of our effective range. Advance 20 more yards, then fire. Full pressure, sustained burst." Private O'Neill guided the tank forward carefully, using every fold in the terrain for cover. At 120 yards, Harding gave the order to halt. "Target acquired," reported Miller. "Firing!" The flamethrower roared to life, sending its stream of liquid fire toward the command bunker. At this range, the stream began to break up before reaching its target. But enough burning napalm struck the bunker to coat its front face with flames. Inside, the effect was immediate. Unlike the smaller bunkers, the command center didn't immediately become uninhabitable, but smoke began filtering through the ventilation system, and the temperature rose steadily. "They're using their flame weapons," reported a sergeant stationed at an observation port. "The front entrance is covered in fire." Nakamura had hoped their main position would be resistant to the flame attack, but now he wasn't so sure. He could feel the heat radiating through the concrete walls, and breathing was becoming more difficult as smoke filled the chamber. "Seal the ventilation ports," he ordered. "Use wet cloths to block the gun ports." These measures helped temporarily, but created a new problem. The bunker began to run out of oxygen. Men coughed and gasped for breath in the increasingly stifling air. Outside, Captain Harding observed the effects of the first flamethrower burst. "Target partially engaged," he reported, "advancing for better position." The Sherman moved forward another 30 yards, now well within the effective range of its flamethrower. At this distance, the stream of napalm would hit with full force. "Fire second burst," ordered Harding. "Target the gun ports and what appears to be the ventilation system on the roof." The second burst was devastatingly effective. Flaming napalm poured through the bunker's defensive openings despite the Japanese attempts to block them. The temperature inside rose to over 150 degrees Fahrenheit within minutes. "We cannot stay here," gasped Lieutenant Tanaka, his uniform soaked with sweat. "We must move to the cave positions or we'll all suffocate." Captain Nakamura knew his subordinate was right, but the decision tore at him. To abandon the command bunker felt like admitting defeat. Something his training and culture had taught him was worse than death. "Prepare for evacuation through the rear tunnel," he finally ordered, fighting withdrawal to position Delta. As the Japanese began their evacuation, American infantry had worked their way up the hillside, establishing positions to catch enemy soldiers fleeing from the bunkers. Marine Sergeant Frank Cooper positioned his squad to cover the rear exit of the command bunker, which intelligence had identified from aerial photographs. "They'll be coming out soon," he told his men. "Remember, we take prisoners if they surrender, but don't take any chances. Many of them will choose to die fighting." Inside the bunker, conditions had become unbearable. The air was a choking mix of smoke and superheated oxygen. Men stumbled toward the rear tunnel, many already suffering from burns and smoke inhalation. "Captain, we must go now," urged Tanaka, supporting his commander, who had been injured by a falling support beam dislodged by the intense heat. Nakamura nodded weakly. His world was collapsing around him, not just physically, but conceptually. The defensive doctrine that had been the foundation of Japanese strategy was being rendered obsolete before his eyes by American technological superiority. As the Japanese soldiers emerged from the tunnel, they were met by Marine rifle fire. Some raised their hands in surrender, an unthinkable action just hours earlier. Others charged forward, preferring death to the shame of capitulation. Within minutes, the organized Japanese defense of Hill 382 had effectively collapsed. By 1700 hours, Colonel Matthews could report to division headquarters that the objective had been secured. American casualties for the day's fighting totaled 27 killed and 104 wounded, significant, but far less than anticipated for taking such heavily fortified positions. "The flame tanks were the difference," he told his executive officer. "Without them, we'd have had to root out each bunker with infantry and demolitions. Casualties would have been 3 times higher, maybe more." The statistics told the story. In 6 hours of combat, 5 Sherman Flamethrower tanks had neutralized 47 Japanese bunkers and pillboxes. Approximately 380 Japanese defenders had been killed, with another 35 taken prisoner, an unusually high surrender rate for Japanese forces, testament to the psychological impact of the flame weapons. Captain Harding's tank had returned to the regiment's assembly area for refueling and maintenance. As his crew worked, Harding took a moment to record the day's events in his journal. "The flamethrower changed everything today," he wrote. "Not just tactically, but psychologically. We faced an enemy indoctrinated never to surrender, yet by the end of the day, we were taking prisoners. The weapon attacked not just their bodies, but their entire concept of warfare. It's terrible, but effective." Private Jackson sat apart from the others during the evening meal, still processing what he had witnessed and participated in. Sergeant Miller noticed his withdrawal and sat beside him. "First time is the hardest," Miller said quietly. "You thinking about what happened to them inside those bunkers?" Jackson nodded. "How do you not think about it?" "By remembering Peleliu," Miller replied. "I was infantry there before transferring to tanks. We lost nearly half my company taking positions like the ones we hit today. Flame tanks save American lives, plain and simple." The next morning, intelligence officers interviewed Japanese prisoners, gathering information about the effect of the flame tanks. Their reports painted a vivid picture of psychological collapse. They described it as hell on earth, reported Captain Eric Peterson, the regiment's intelligence officer. Several mentioned that their training had prepared them to die honorably in battle, but not to be burned alive or suffocated in what were supposed to be protective positions. One officer said something particularly interesting. That it wasn't just the physical effect of the weapon, but what it represented. "What did he mean by that?" asked Colonel Matthews. "He said the flame tanks demonstrated American industrial superiority in a way that conventional weapons didn't. Any nation can build a rifle or even an artillery piece, but the technology and resources required to field these specialized weapons spoke to a level of industrial capability that Japan couldn't hope to match. It made their defeat seem inevitable. This psychological dimension would prove as important as the tactical advantage throughout the Pacific campaign. As word spread among Japanese forces about the American burning tanks, defensive doctrine that had been effective against conventional attacks became obsolete overnight. For Captain Nakamura, captured while being treated for burns and smoke inhalation, the revelation was personally devastating. In the field hospital, an American doctor treated his injuries with the same care given to Marine casualties. "Why do you treat me?" Nakamura asked through an interpreter. "I am your enemy." The doctor, a lieutenant named Morris, continued applying burn ointment as he replied, "Because you're a patient now, not an enemy. That's how we see it." This treatment contradicted everything Nakamura had been taught about Americans, that they were barbaric, that they tortured prisoners, that surrender meant certain death and dishonor. The cognitive dissonance was almost as painful as his physical injuries. In the weeks that followed, the 3rd Marine Division continued its advance across Guam. The pattern established that first day repeated itself. Flame tanks would target key defensive positions, breaking Japanese resistance with minimal American casualties. By August 10th, organized Japanese resistance on Guam had ended. Though isolated soldiers would hold out in the island's jungles for months, some for years, the flame tanks proved so effective that production was accelerated. By the time of the Okinawa campaign in April 1945, the Marines had deployed significantly more of these specialized vehicles. Their effectiveness contributed to the growing sense among Japanese military leaders that the war was ultimately unwinnable, a realization that would eventually lead to Japan's surrender. For the men who operated these weapons, the moral calculations were complex, but ultimately resolute. As Captain Harding would write in his final report, "The flamethrower tank represents a terrible weapon whose deployment saved countless American lives. Its psychological impact often proved as important as its physical destruction." Japanese defenders who'd been prepared to fight to the death against conventional weapons often surrendered when faced with this new technology. While the human consequences were severe, the alternative would have been even costlier for both sides. When Lieutenant Colonel Woodruff submitted his after-action report, he included a personal observation. "What we witnessed on Guam was more than a tactical victory. It was the moment when the Japanese defender, for all his courage and sacrifice, confronted the full technological and industrial might of the United States. The flame tank represented not just a weapon, but a symbol of a war-making capacity that Japan could not match." In that moment, the outcome of the Pacific War was written, though many difficult battles remained. Years later, in 1972, a military historian interviewed William Jackson, by then a professor of engineering at MIT. When asked about his experiences operating the flamethrower system, Jackson reflected thoughtfully. "We were barely out of our teens, using a weapon of unprecedented psychological impact. The flame tank didn't just destroy enemy positions, it shattered their conception of how war worked. Japanese doctrine was built around the willingness to sacrifice lives to preserve territory. Our technology made that doctrine obsolete overnight. The positions they had spent months building became death traps in minutes. It was terrible but necessary, and it ultimately saved lives on both sides by hastening the end of the war." The Sherman Flamethrower tanks would remain in the American arsenal through the Korean War. though they were never again deployed with the same devastating psychological effect as in the Pacific campaigns of 1944-45. Their legacy lives on in modern warfare, where technological superiority continues to provide not just tactical advantage, but psychological dominance. And that concludes our story. If you made it this far, please share your thoughts in the comments. What part of this historical account surprised you most? Don't forget to subscribe for more untold stories from World War II, and check out the video on screen for another incredible tale from history. Until next time.